you have seen my bio. I'm not going to go more into it than that. So we're going to move on. Okay. So has anybody ever asked themselves or had this question come to mind during practice? Am I still coaching here, or is this becoming something else? And really, this was the question that led me to my research, because I kept asking this question often in my own practice. And so this evening, really, what we're going to be considering is that question and how we navigate what I have termed the gray space. And I'm going to explain what that is in a moment. But today we're just going to set the scene. So the foundations are a little bit around the research that I've done, some of the explanation around the gray space. I'm then going to share with you 4 of the frameworks that came out of the research that I did, and some of the practical applications for that. And then finally, how this can integrate into your own practice as coaches. So again, the intentions for this session is to begin to recognize the gray space. And, you know, some of you may already have clear recognition of that. So that might be a little bit of refining, or even, you know, a little bit of acknowledgement. It might be a little bit of that comes out of this evening for you. What I did find when I was doing my research is that individuals didn't have awareness until they participated in the research and something was named, and then they were able to see more and more of the gray space. And really the idea behind this is something named allows us to become aware of it, and then the more aware we are of something, the more able we are able to navigate that. And so again, that is about navigating this in an ethical way, both for ourselves and for our clients, and for the coaching practice as a whole, as a wider, you know, practice. So again, I will be sharing with you the core navigational frameworks that came up. I will be talking about moving from the idea of referral to signposting, and explaining a little bit about why that came as something that was important to me and to my participants in the research. And around contracting, and I know that we talk about contracting a lot, but actually this is contracting maybe moment by moment because of navigating this gray space, this complexity, and what that might look like, and how contracting can really serve us. And so again, the last one is to feel confident as coaches when challenging material comes up into our practices, and how we have these conversations. Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to do was just to share a little bit of information, and some of you may be very aware of this, but I think it's important to highlight. And again, this sets the scene for the gray space. So 1 in 4 adults, and in particular, this was sexual trauma, experienced trauma before the age of 18. With what's happened post-COVID, post-pandemic, these were reports from the UK and the US, is that mental health has increased, like has worsened, and that's still happening. And, you know, obviously the landscape has shifted in the world since doing my research, and there's a whole heap of things that are happening in our landscape at the moment, from a collective perspective, that are impacting every person at the moment, right? And so again, 73% of coaches encounter complexities within their practice. And so one of the things that I discovered when I was doing my research is that those can be highlighted very briefly and maybe touched upon, but how we actually work with that, most coach training doesn't really go into this in depth. And a lot of the times we are told to refer on or refer out. And a lot of my book does question that. And one of the things that I start to talk about is ethical thinking, because again, we can have ethical frameworks and we might be adhering to them, but actually, as a result, we're not actually practicing ethically. And so that's something that I won't be going into too heavily this evening. But if that is something that is of interest to you, I would encourage you to read my book, because I do go into this in quite a bit of detail. Okay. So again, as we see here, there's this idea of, the myth of, as coaches, we work with purely functional clients. I know not all of us work that way, and many of us acknowledge that that's not the reality, but the argument as a whole when it comes to coaching is that we work with a healthy, high-functioning population, right? In reality, again, the myth is that coaching is only for high-functioning individuals, that mental health shouldn't appear in coaching, well, poor mental health anyway, and that there's clear boundaries that separate coaching and therapy, or coaching and psychotherapy and those counseling, more therapeutic areas of work. And if something like that emerges in our practice, the competencies and the ethical frameworks suggest to refer on to therapy. And again, one of the arguments that I make is that this is not always in the client's interest, and the way that we do this is really important. And this is where my idea of signposting comes into it, and I will share in more and greater detail in a moment, alongside developing critical and ethical thinking. So the reality of things is that we are human beings and we are complex creatures. And when individuals arrive in our coaching practices, they bring the whole of themselves. They cannot compartmentalize, even if they try. All of them might turn up at times, and it's not always conducive to know whether somebody is coachable on our first coaching session. And sometimes, things pop up, maybe 4 sessions into working with the client, and they have psychological safety, they feel that they've built trust, there's good working rapport, and then they disclose trauma. And so, it's about how we navigate when these sorts of things occur and arise in our coaching practices. And really, this leads me onto the gray space. And what I suggest is, again, depending on how you work as a coach, your area of expertise, whether that's stress management, resilience, transformation, transition, with those sorts of subjects, we are going to have trauma show up in our coaching roles. However, that being said, even if we're executive coaches and we're working in organizations, once again, we're complex human beings, and one area of life bleeds into another. And so, again, depending on the level of safety or the relationship, the client may disclose something that they haven't shared with anybody else. And we may find that things are turning up in our coaching practices that technically aren't this high functioning, no mental health difficulties, etc., etc. And so really that leads me into the gray space and what the gray space is. And when I did my doctoral research, the question that I asked was, how can I and other coaches improve practice of dealing with ethics and managing boundaries in the gray space when we're working with our clients? And so here, this image depicts that the boundaries aren't as clear cut as maybe some of the literature would express, as some of the territories that we as coaches might hold the line, and therapists may hold the line as well. And that in reality, when we are in practice, it is much more complex and much more blurry at times. And instead of us trying to really define the line and draw a hard line, and that actually in some respects coming to acknowledge that there is blurring, and how we become aware of that and how we navigate that is much more ethical and more safe for our clients and more safe for us as practitioners. And so here what we see is the white represents the coaching and the black represents therapeutic space, and at times they bleed into each other. And really, when I did my research, what I found is that this concept had been spoken about, never been researched on how to navigate it. And what we found was some of the distinctions as to whether that bleeding occurs is it's dependent on the coachee, what they bring, where they're willing to go, what they're wanting to disclose. And it's also dependent on the coach and their scope of practice, their training, their backgrounds, and what they are comfortable with and what they are capable and have capacity and competence to hold. So it's not a clear-cut, one-fit answer for all when it comes to this. And again, this is where this idea of ethical thinking really comes into it. Okay. So I'm going to ask you just to take a moment and again, just to think about this, and this might be something that you reflect on within your practice over the next coming weeks and days. And again, you know, if there's questions that come up, we can address this at the end. But think of a time, you know, now that I've defined it in this particular way, and again, you may be like, I know exactly what you're talking about. I experience this in my practice all the time. Or this may be like, oh, I hadn't thought of it like this before. You know, think of a time you encountered the gray space. What happened? How did it feel for you? How did you notice you were responding? And what did you do when these sorts of complex situations started emerging in your practice? Okay. So just moving on to the frameworks that emerged through my research. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of the research process itself and the research design, just from a timing perspective, and I'm sure there's other things that we might like to do. And if that is something that you feel interested in and would like to know more about, I do detail the research design in the book that I've written. So what came out from the first round of our action research together with I had 13 different coaches from various different organizations, backgrounds. Some were coaching psychologists, some were psychologically informed coaches, others were coaches from various backgrounds and trainings. So I had a diverse mix of coaches, which was wonderful. And I'm very grateful for that. And these were some of the themes that I drew from our in-depth work together over 6 months. And the first one was holding space. And so again, the ideas of this framework is how to navigate when these complexities start to show up in our coaching practice. What do we do as coaches? And the first one was holding space. And here it was creating a container of safety for the complexities that emerge. And I will get into more detail about this in a moment. But again, just from a timing perspective, we're kind of going to be doing this on a high level this evening. The second was keeping a watchful eye. And with that, there was multiple factors happening for the coaches in this keeping a watchful eye. There was also this idea of maintaining awareness and presence in keeping this watchful eye. So there's this idea of keeping an eye on ourselves, keeping an eye on the client, keeping an eye on the container, and multiple other things alongside this awareness and this position of presence. So again, these different themes and frameworks bled into each other, and you might have had multiple aspects of these at play at any one time. The third was embodied awareness. So again, using somatic intelligence as part of holding space and keeping a watchful eye. And if we think about nervous system regulation and things like that, becoming aware of our own nervous systems, becoming aware of our own window of tolerances, etc., etc. And the final one was normalizing. So again, here, you know, very much, I had a number of coaches who had a very trauma-informed lens. And I will very much like to highlight here, coming from a trauma-informed lens does not mean working with trauma. It is about being aware of what trauma looks like. And also it's being informed as to how you may approach somebody who may have experienced trauma. So it's about you as a practitioner having a level of awareness rather than you as a practitioner working with the client's trauma. So I'd like to really distinguish that. So again, here it is about normalizing. It is around reducing stigma and shame when complexities show up in our coaching practice, whether that's mental health difficulties, whether it's a client disclosing trauma with us, or distress, or anything else that may emerge in our coaching rooms. Okay, so just getting into a little bit more around the holding space. So again, as I suggested, it is about containing, like creating a container for the client when they bring these complexities to us. And here it is around holding presence. And again, I go into greater detail of what that presence actually is and how that looks, and you know, practical applications around that. So again, it's this holding a state of presence rather than trying to fix what the client is bringing. And I know I may be, you know, preaching to the choir here, because as coaches, we definitely take a position of not fixing, right? So, and it is about empowering the client to come up with their own solutions and their own ways of dealing and navigating. But, you know, so I may be stating the obvious, but anyway, this is what emerged. It is about witnessing without trying to change. And again, what's really interesting is there has been a book written around trauma-informed or trauma work as coaches when trauma shows up. And one of the things that they talk about is not being triggered. So it's about understanding yourself, understanding your own trauma, understanding your own triggers, and doing that self-work as a practitioner so that we are able to witness, we are able to hold, we are able to presence without our own stuff being triggered, and moving us out of that space of being able to hold a space for the client. You know, a safe container for emotions, maintaining professional boundaries, and allowing what needs to emerge. And so I feel very strongly about that, because we may be the first person that this individual has disclosed something to. And so holding that with a sense of sacredness and allowing something to emerge, in my view, is really important, so that the client feels held and seen and validated. Again, what I'm suggesting here is that we're not necessarily working with that, but we are creating containment for whatever comes, and that we have this presence of all is welcome. And then as coaches, we help to coach the client towards what the best solutions are for themselves, in a way of getting the right support for whatever has emerged. Okay. So it's not about being passive and not doing anything. It's not about agreeing with everything that the client says or does. It's not about taking on the emotions. It's not about becoming the therapist. And it's not about rescuing or fixing. So it is about being conscious, being boundaried, and being present. Okay, so I am going to take a moment for us to just, before we shift into the next framework, because this kind of leads us into that, is I just want to do a very small embodiment exercise here this evening. And so I'm going to invite everybody to take a moment and to shift, and if possible, to get their feet on their floor, or to just get into a comfortable position. And if you feel comfortable with your screens on, great. If you want to turn them off, feel free to do that too. And I'm going to invite you to just take 3 deep breaths. So breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth, and in through the nose and out through the mouth. And one last time, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. And if this feels comfortable for you, this is all an invitation. I would like to invite you to place your hand on your heart and just allow yourself a moment to drop into the body, to connect into the body. And with your hand on your heart, maybe connecting into the heart area, the heart space, however that is interpreted for you. And I'm going to invite you to feel your presence expanding. And again, however you make sense of that. And the thing that I'm going to be inviting you to become curious about is whether you notice any shift happening in your body. That may be physiological, maybe emotional, there may be a sort of a relaxing that happens or a tightening that happens. But the key here is just to become curious and to notice any small shifts that you may be picking up in your body with your presence and with your attention. Wonderful. So there's no right or wrong way of doing this. And whatever you've observed, even if there was nothing at all, it's absolutely perfect. So I'm going to invite you to take another deep breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. And maybe just taking a minute to begin to bring your presence outside, your awareness outside of your body, back into the room, becoming a little orientated in the room that you're in, maybe just having a look around at the room, starting to shift your attention and awareness back to the screen and coming back into the session with me. Wonderful. So the purpose of this exercise was just to demonstrate a little bit around this embodied presence. And again, the subtle shifts that we may have in our bodies where we shift and change our awareness and our attention. And again, what I discovered through my research was that containment, that presence, and even keeping a watch about all these themes, really individuals started to use this presencing and this attention and this meta-awareness, if you want to call it, metacognition at times as well, of what was happening for themselves, the coach, the coachee, and also the container that was being held. So the second framework was about keeping a watchful eye. And here again, it's about maintaining this awareness, this observer awareness, this meta awareness, and here what we are doing is we're tracking the client's capacity. Are they becoming dysregulated? Do we need to slow things down? Do we need to pause? Are they seeming like they're becoming flooded? are they starting to become distressed, or are they calming down? All of these things are things that we are going to be keeping an eye on. We're going to be monitoring the sessions dynamics. Sessions may be changing moment to moment, but also over the course of our sessions together, what is happening in that? What's happening in those dynamics? How are they shifting and changing? Are we seeing decline? What are we noticing as this material starts to surface? And if we decide to carry on working with the client, are we noticing any energy shifts with the client? And again, if we're thinking about collapse or freeze, or more agitation happening, what sort of energy shifts are we starting to become aware of during our sessions with our clients? Are we recognizing signs of overwhelm and individuals shifting outside of their window of tolerance? And are we staying orientated to safety? Safety within ourselves, safety within our own nervous systems, within our own emotional and psychological beings, as well as that within our clients and within the working relationship that we have with our clients and the work that we're doing. So again, what watching the watchful eye is not, it's not what we're looking for is that we're looking for signs when clients are showing things such as disassociation or spacing out, and that's what we want to slow down. We want to slow the sessions down where there are overwhelming emotions emerging. And again, this is not to say we stop it, but we start to pay attention about it. We start to make little mental notes about these things, and we start to build picture. We start to gather information, and we, again, through keeping that watchful eye, we start to build a picture about where our coaching work is going, what supervision we might need, what additional support we may draw in, and what sort of signposting we do later on if required. Again, things to watch, and again, these are people stepping outside their window of tolerance, rapid speech and agitation. And as I mentioned, there's body tension, that may be freeze or collapse that is happening. Signs to, help us to ensure that we're on track and we can keep going is that the clients are present and engaged, even if they're distressed, even if there's difficult content, that they're able to reflect and respond, that their cognition is engaged. And if we think about from a neuroscience perspective, that their prefrontal cortex is online, which means that they're not flooded. We monitor their breathing. How are they breathing? Are they in their body? Are they hyperventilating? Things like that. And what is the energy like between me and my client? Is that working relationship, is that collaborative energy still there? Are we still working with each other? Are we still there together? Okay. So the third framework was around normalising. And here it's about reducing stigma around the human experience. So again, what was fascinating for me is I had a range of coaches that I had the honor of working with through my doctoral research. And we had individuals who were past therapists in clinical settings who had become coaches, all the way through to coaches who went and did mental health first aid training, and then had an awareness of like, oh, okay, everybody has mental health, and mental health is something that shows up, and their exposure to it was quite limited until doing my research. And so I had quite a broad spectrum of individuals and their understanding of mental health. And so again, it's really important for us as coaches to have a good in-depth understanding of what mental health is, that we all have mental health, that there is a continuum, that we move up and down on mental health, for us to be aware of when there's signs of distress, how to signpost correctly, how to normalize. And languaging here is really important. How we experience when a client mental health is declining, and are we able to hold that without getting distressed ourselves? And, you know, again, there are coaches who will very openly in supervision groups say that there are certain subjects that dysregulate them, that upset them, that they wouldn't be able to work with clients, certain traumas or certain mental health conditions. You know, not in the sense of working on those conditions themselves, maybe working on a coaching goal, but that client has experienced that, or is has that in the background that they're working through with the right support and practitioners. So again, knowing yourself, knowing what your scope of practice is, knowing where you feel comfortable is really important as well for transparency when it comes to working with our clients. Again, having an understanding around emotions and emotional intelligence and how emotions inform our decision making, our values, and that emotions are part and parcel of the human experience. And very, very important, and I could bang a big drum about this, this is a trauma-informed aspect, is to really watch our languaging around narratives that imply brokenness. And this can happen very subtly, and unfortunately, this happens across all helping professions. I've seen this happen in the coaching space, but I have also seen this happen in the psychological space, in the therapeutic space, where there is still languaging that pathologizes, and this narrative around brokenness is still alive. And so again, my encouragement and really strong advocacy here is really to watch our languaging and the narratives that we may have implicitly or explicitly. And finally, language empowers or disempowers. So once again, I used for transparency, I came from quite a social constructionist viewpoint. And here, language is not seen as something that is passive. Language is not seen as something that just describes. Language is something that we are actively doing something with. And so again, having awareness of how we utilize language is really important. Okay. So here is a couple of examples of how we might move away from that broken narrative and how we may actually have more of a trauma-informed lens. You know, so instead of that's not normal, you know, again, if we're normalizing here, we're like, that makes complete sense. And I know for some of you, this is going to be like stating the obvious, but there are spaces and places where unfortunately this still needs to be addressed. You need therapy. Again, depending on the client, particularly if they have a lot of shame because of the experiences that they may have, we might be unintentionally reinforcing shame that the client may have experienced very innocently by telling the client that they need therapy. So again, here it's about language that is helpful. What sort of ways can we get you the support that you need if this is not my area of expertise? My role here is to support you, and part of that is signposting you to the appropriate support so that you get exactly what you need. That's too much, or I can't, or this subject's too much for me. Okay. Or when you say to a client, once they decide, God, that's too much, actually, you're dealing with a lot, right? I would suspect that none of us would say this, but, you know, it again needs to be highlighted. You're broken. You're responding in a very normal way to a very difficult situation. And again, oh gosh, that's a red flag, or oh, there's a red flag there. We may say, you know, this might be something that we want to pay attention to. So we can see here how the use of language becomes very important in, number one, having that trauma-informed lens, and number two, in helping to normalize when things emerge in the space. So the final framework that I'd like to share with you this evening is around embodied awareness. And again, here, this is slightly different. There was nuances to holding space and keeping a watchful eye. This embodied awareness was really about the coach using their bodies and their embodied awareness and their introspection, interoception, extroception as ways of monitoring what was happening in the sessions. So here we have this idea of somatic intelligence coming to the fore, and there's quite a lot of neuroscience that does talk to this. So again, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I can't remember her name, but there is a coach who has written and done a lot of research around this, and she comes from that neuroscience perspective. So there are some really great books and information out there around this. Another individual who's a neuroscientist called Dr. Tara Stewart talks about the difference between intuition and instinct. And so if we're thinking about, intuition and our gut feel, her definition of intuition is embodied wisdom. We've experienced something, and our bodies, we've learned through something, we've gained that wisdom, both cognitively and embodied. And what's happening as our bodies is registering that wisdom. And so for her, she sees intuition as a neuroscientist, as that embodied wisdom, rather than instinct, which can be reactive and not always something that we can trust 100%. So there's a distinction there with that. So again, here, what we're talking about is that embodied wisdom here, that gut feeling, that intuition, and becoming aware of it. And again, using alongside our cognition, alongside supervision, etc., but taking notes of that when something has shifted in the room, when something feels slightly off, or when we pick something up with a client, and there's various ways of bringing and highlighting these things to our clients, depending on how we work and how things have been trained. But there may be examples where, a client says something and we may share with the client, when you mentioned that, actually, I felt this in my body. And again, it depends on the relationship, it depends on the nature of the way that you work, etc. But actually, that may be rich information that the client is able to utilize and work with as well. So, we have that therapeutic idea of transference and countertransference. And so we might even think of it a little like that too. And so again, there's this idea of, having this embodied awareness, tracking the changes that are happening in our body as being an internal compass for us as well. So we don't disregard, we're not, cut off from the neck down, and it's only the cognition and the intellect that has a say here. We want to be utilizing both aspects of that. Okay. So again, these are to contemplate. We won't be going into breakout rooms this evening. This is really just for you to start playing around with the frameworks and seeing how you might apply. So in case study A, we have Sarah. She's a C-suite executive. She has a successful career. And in her third session with you, she shares that she has experienced childhood sexual abuse and that she has never told anybody about this before. She becomes incredibly emotional and she apologizes repeatedly for becoming so emotional. And so my question would be, what frameworks out of the 4 that we've spoken about this evening would you begin to apply and draw from? And what might you do as a coach if this shows up in your space? The second one is Marcus. He's a tech entrepreneur. He comes in with relationship goals, again, depending on what type of coach you are. He mentions that he's been feeling depressed for quite some time. And he says that his doctor wants to put him on medication for his depression, but all he wants to do is he wants to focus on finding love. So I'm just going to invite everybody to make sure that they're on mute, please. I can hear somebody has come off mute, and I'm not taking questions just at the moment, unless there's a technical issue that you need to flag to me. Okay, so once again, which frameworks might you apply? And again, what would you do? How would you navigate this as a coach? And once we get to our Q&A, if anybody has some questions and would like to discuss this further, I would warmly welcome that. Okay, so the next point that I wanted to get onto is, and I speak quite heavily about this in my research and in the book, and this was actually something that myself and other coaching practitioners felt very strongly about. And here, once again, this does come from a social constructionist viewpoint, in the sense that language matters, that we do something with language, and that language is not just passive, that language constructs our reality, it constructs the way that we interact with the world, and it also constructs the meaning that we hold. And also, as practitioners, it constructs how we practice, how we navigate, what we do and what we don't. And my argument here was that the word referral is in direct conflict with us as practitioners, as coaches, because the word referral comes from a medical model. It implies expert diagnosis. It implies client, like patient via instead of client. And ultimately what it does is it puts the coach in the position of decision-making. And so number one, it puts us into ethical conflict immediately, because as coaches, we are not in the position of making decisions of what our clients should do. And also it moves us out of that collaboration with our clients, and it puts clients into a position of loss of agency. And for me, this was particularly important, particularly if we've had clients who have experienced trauma, and most importantly, if they've experienced relational trauma. And once again, what we don't want to do is have our clients feel that they are once again by the hands of somebody else, losing agency. And so again, what I'm suggesting here is not about not signposting the client onto additional services, but it's about how we do it and the languaging that we use, and that languaging matters. And so it is about signposting. Signposting puts us back into a coaching position. It puts us back into exploring multiple options with our clients. It puts us as coaches back, and our clients back, into being the ones that are making choices. It puts us as coaches and clients back into a position of it being a collaborative exploration. And lastly, and most importantly for me anyway, it maintains the client being in a position of empowerment. And so again here, you know, what I suggest in at the end of my research, because part and parcel of it is to improve practice, is one of the things that I would like to see is the word referral being removed from all coaching text, and for signposting to be replaced, because of all what word am I looking for? Connotations that the word referral holds, and the power dynamics that come with it. So again, how we signpost, how we keep the client in a position of empowerment. So I'm noticing that you shared X, Y, and Z, and I'm wondering, you know, there may be a number of ways to get support. You get to choose what feels right. How can I help you explore your options? What would be most supportive for you right now? And one of the things that I share in my research, and actually this was shared with me on a trauma-informed coaching training that I did, is when a client discloses trauma to us, we hand that back to the client. So we thank them for trusting us, we honor them for the experience and, for bringing that to us. And we ask them what they would like to do with the disclosure, how they would like to take that information forward. And again, here, that's where the signposting languaging becomes really important, and how we might then move into signposting. The other thing that I would talk about here, and I'm just going to see it again, this moves into contracting and how we set up signposting in contracting. And so one of the things that I do is I contract right in the beginning of my sessions, even when I'm doing an initial chemistry session with a client. I will talk about, my scope of practice. I will talk about my areas of expertise and what are outside of my areas of expertise. And should anything, and some of the languaging that I might use is, all of you is welcome. And my job is to let you know what I have skill set in and what I don't. And for us to find the right support should something come up that is beyond my skill set. And so I start contracting right in the beginning, should I need to signpost my client later on. And again, the other thing that I do within this gray space is, when the gray space emerges, I am very transparent about it. I name that. I name the complexities. I name my scope of practice. I name where we're working with the client, where we're working with each other. It becomes a collaborative process. So I, again, without becoming too technical, but I take a pluralistic view within my practice. And again, that's a very collaborative view of bringing the client on board with the way that we navigate the coaching. And for me, I feel that that is empowered. And therefore, at times, we might be contracting, particularly if there's complexity, particularly if there's trauma, moment by moment, sometimes within a session, as to what our boundaries are, where we can and can't work based on my skill set and what the client's coaching goals are and the trauma that has emerged in the session. Okay. So again, here, it's about knowing when to signpost. And there are immediate moments where signposting immediately is crucial and important, such as suicidal ideation. If the client is currently experiencing abuse or in danger, if there's psychosis, if there's severe dissociation, if there is substance abuse affecting their actual day-to-day functioning. Again, here, for me, there's a collaborative exploration. And again, some coaches may have a hard line with this. And this, again, is a very personal thing, and also your scope of practice. I have had lots of trainings in various different shapes and forms. And so for me, I feel my scope of practice is quite broad. And I also feel comfortable with certain things, such as if the client is experiencing anxiety. And here the collaborative exploration will be, where are they with that? How is it showing up? Are they still functional? So Grant talks about a model. He has a 4-quadrant framework where he talks about distressed but functioning. So if my client is functioning, yes, they're experiencing anxiety, but to which degrees, how's it impacting their lives? And we will have a collaborative exploration as to whether coaching is still appropriate, whether I have the skill set and capacity, etc., etc. And so for me, the collaborative exploration might be around, past trauma disclosure, relationship challenges that the person may be having, or experiencing different life transitions and emotional complexities. And this list may be different for each one of you. And also, I would really encourage you to have an honest evaluation of what your scope of practice is. And should you want to have the capacity to hold more, to go and do more training that enables you to do that. The other thing that I would highly recommend is that we build our professional networks. And you know, unfortunately, there is still a little bit of territory wars that happens. Not all of us are like that, but, you know, there's still some territory wars between coaches and therapists. And, you know, so it is about finding therapists who are open to working and collaborating with coaches. I see our role as coaches as actually supporting the therapeutic work and vice versa. I don't see one being better than the other. And I see that on a client's journey, they may need different things at different times. And so having a professional network, a variety of a professional network is very useful depending on what the client brings to us. Ultimately, it's about empowering the client, right? Okay, so your personal action plan after the lecture this evening. Hearing everything that has been shared this evening, what one thing will you be changing in your practice? How is there one way that you'll be clarifying a little more around a boundary within your practice? And with all of this, in one way, how will you be more confident in showing up in your practice and with your clients? One thing, you know, and I applied these questions to myself when I was doing my research because it was a doctoral I did action research. So I had to really reflect on my own practice and then implement change within my practice. And it was an iterative process. And one of the things, you know, was actually changing the languaging of the word referral out of my practice to signposting. And at the time, I thought that it was quite insignificant. But when I really sat and reflected and journaled and looked at the way that the subtleties of it is actually, it was huge. And it shifted my practice in the way that I showed up with my clients, the way that I showed up in my supervision, and even the position of power that I held within myself just by changing, referring to, like changing those two words from referral to signposting. Okay. So lastly, just ending on some reflections. What surprised you today from what I've shared? What challenged your assumptions? Where do you feel more confident as a result of hearing this? What questions still remain around this? And what are your next steps? And there's one thing that I'd like to share here just around the questions that remain, is that sometimes we don't have our questions answered. And actually having those questions remaining become our allies. So when I went into my doctoral research, one of my questions was, am I in the therapeutic terrain here? Am I still coaching? Am I allowed to be here? Can I be here? And that question, when I went into my doctoral research, was actually filled with a lot of anxiety and was coming from a place of an anxious place where I wanted to have answers to those questions. And when I ended my doctoral research, those questions were still there and they hadn't been answered. But what had shifted is my relationship to those questions. And what had shifted was those questions became an ally for me and actually a sounding board for me, and was something that enabled me to develop more ethical thinking. Because asking myself moment to moment, where am I in this space? How am I navigating this space? Is this therapeutic terrain? Am I doing a good job here? Should I be here? You know, when we look at those 4 frameworks, we can see how that question, when engaging with it as allies rather than something that we've got to get away from or solve, actually become a resource. Okay, so every coach encounters a gray space. This is my firm belief. I did come across some organizations that were hellbound on saying that the boundaries between coaching and therapy are distinct and their two shall never cross. And what I found was exactly the opposite to that. And my argument is that it is not useful to suggest that the boundary is hard and fast, because what it does is it makes us hide things under the carpet, and actually it makes us all vulnerable. So acknowledging that every coach is going to encounter the gray space is safer for all involved. That hopefully you have some frameworks that have either been reinforced, affirmed, or you have something new to take away. That there's this idea of collaboration rather than this idea of referral, and the power that that idea holds. And that there's this idea of being brave as coaches when complex and difficult material arises, and that you have courage to be in service of your clients. I know that you all would anyway, because otherwise you wouldn't become coaches. I know that. But it's again just, to really reiterate that courage, and that this is a continuous learning path. And again, as coaches, I know we love that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We are lifelong learners. And so the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek. And very much that was my experience of doing this research and coming to these conclusions and understanding more how we can navigate this complex space. So here are my details. Please feel free to take a photo or a screenshot. I also think my website details will be with information. So please feel free to reach out to me should you so want. If you also like my slides, please feel free. I do supervision around this work as well. So again, and this is a broad topic. I spent years and years. So this is just an hour's worth, and this is, a very high level overview of some of the key topics that came out of the research. Thank you so very much for your time, your attention. Thank you for being here. And I hope that this has been of service and of use, and that there's utility that you get out of this evening. Thank you. Thank you so much.